Good morning, everybody. Nice, beautiful summer day, and glad to see all of you. Before we start, we'll go ahead and we'll open up with prayer, and then we'll get into the lesson. So let us bow our heads. Dear Lord, we just thank you for the opportunity again to study your word that is so wide and so deep. We know that we can study it for all of eternity, and we will never learn everything that is in your character and what you've done for us. But for today, Lord, help us to gain just some additional knowledge that we didn't know before, some additional glimpse into your character that we didn't know before, so that we can continue to use it to refine ourselves and reflect your character and hasten your coming. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So just to kind of back up a little bit, we just started the quarterly called Exodus. Exodus means mass exodus, and this with the Israelites being freed from bondage under Egypt. And there's a number, the name of this lesson is called Rough Start. So you may think, geez, Moses has already had a rough start. I mean, at 40 years old, he thought he would take things in his own hands. He killed an Egyptian, and then he tried to intervene into a fight between two Hebrews, and instead they told him, "Who made you judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian?" And then Moses knew the thing that he had done was known, and he fled. And he was gone for 40 years. God worked with him. He married. He raised a family. He wrote the first, he wrote Genesis and the book of Job. So God was definitely working with him. And God appeared to him, in the mountain by the burning bush. So you think, wow, that's a pretty rough start already. Now it's going to be smooth sailing. However, as Moses comes back, he's now 80 years old, and his brother Aaron is 83 years old. Now they are tasked with leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. And since Moses has waited such a long time and he's communed with God such a long time, you would think that, okay, this is it. But instead, things don't go according to plan. It's not like the Israelites envisioned, and it's not like how Moses envisioned it either. So there's a few texts that outline the lesson. Exodus 5, 1 through 23. So this is after Moses talks to Pharaoh about letting the Israelites go so that they may sacrifice unto God. And Pharaoh says, I don't know God. In fact, come to think of it, you know all that quota of bricks that you got to make? Well, you still have the same quota, but now find your own straw. And if you don't, then there's going to be consequences. And then in Revelation 11:8, it talks about a spiritual place called Sodom in Egypt, which is not a good place, where the Lord was crucified. So it's talking about, it mentions Egypt as a representation of a spiritually corrupt place. And in the book of Exodus, we see Egypt as that literal representation, but then later on in Revelation, it is referred to as that symbolic representation. Then in Exodus 6, 1 through 13, God gives Moses and Aaron the charge to bring Israel out of Egypt in spite of all the resistance and the difficulty and the murmuring. God is still saying, I'm going to do this work, and it is not going to be left undone. Then in Psalms 73, verses 23 through 26, the writer says that the flesh faileth, but God is my strength and my portion. So in spite of everything that may be going on, the writer has faith that God is still the ultimate prize, the ultimate to strive for, the ultimate fulfillment of all of our heart's desires. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16, it says that ye are the temple of the living God. Okay, it's talking about God ministers not only to his people, but also to us individually. And it is his desire to walk with us and to abide with us and to change us if we let him. And then in Exodus 6:28 through 7:7, this is when Moses and Aaron speak to Pharaoh. And the memory text is, afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. So in this case, he's not saying, wow, this is news I've never heard before. Who is God? Tell me about him so that I may understand who this God is. What Pharaoh's saying is, I don't care. I don't know who God is. And I'm not going to take the effort to find out who God is, because my decision is made no matter what. I have no desire to know God, and therefore it is inconsequential to the decisions I'm going to be making. Just talking about rough starts, are there other stories in the Bible later on that talk about rough starts? In other words, God has promised something magnificent, very grand, a great blessing. But the start of that blessing is not smooth sailing. Like, everything does not fall into place in the beginning. What are some examples? Yes?
Well, Christianity right after the cross.
Yes.
Jesus had said, I'm going to come again. And that's what they expected. But what happened? They very quickly got into persecution by the Romans.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah. I'm going to have a people, and we're going to preach the gospel over all the world. And when the writers are saying now the time of our salvation is nearer than we ever thought, I don't know if they really thought in the literal time span that it would be, or if they're really looking at the big picture. If you look at the big picture, it's not billions of years or millions of years, it's thousands of years. So I guess in that context, it is pretty close. But yeah, that was a great promise. Christ came to die for our sins, but to show us the character of God. And yet after that, there was a lot of turmoil. Other examples? I mean, how about David? David was promised that he was going to be king. And Saul was just anointed king right off the bat. But David had to run for his life for years. Even though he was anointed, he was not king right away. And he was basically always on the run. So that wasn't, and not only on the run, but on the run because Saul was pursuing him to kill him. How about Joseph? He had this dream, that, all his brothers, would, bow down to him and that he would be a ruler. And he told this dream, which caused a lot of jealousy and anger stirred up among his brothers. And instead, he was sold into slavery into Egypt. And then he found a niche where Potimus was looked at him as a faithful servant and gave him control over everything that he had. And then Joseph, adhering to the commandments of God, says, when his wife threw herself at him, says, how can I sin, do this great sin against God? And my master has given me everything except you. And what was his reward? He was thrown into jail. So that was a really rough start. And I don't know how he would not be thinking, this is not the dream that I had. But later on, he was made second only to Pharaoh, and everything was under his control in Egypt. Sometimes I wonder if God does this on purpose, because if we were to get the blessing right off the bat, then that blessing would actually be a curse. Yes, Rola.
Even Jesus' disciples, when they were trying to tell people about Jesus, they all went through a lot of going to prison and being accused of different things. Paul, his story with the shipwreck, and how many times he was accused of, different things. Like they all had a rough start, or they all had some things going wrong in the way that they tried to.
That was the other example I also had listed too, was Paul as well. Paul, once he converted, it wasn't like, prosperity for you now that you've come on to the right side. It was, he not only took on the commitment of spreading the gospel, he did it through the very persecution that he himself was helping to propagate. How about Abraham? Abraham was shown that he would have all these descendants, and a great nation would come out of him. And yet it didn't seem like it happened. It didn't happen right away. And him and his wife Sarah were getting in years, so it didn't look like it was going to be humanly possible. So it required a lot of faith. And then even after he had a son, then God said, go sacrifice your only son. So, and then, Jacob, these are just a few examples. We can go through, there's hundreds of examples, but there seems to be a coupling with God's promises and persecution that we go through. And I think James talks about how, having persecution leads to patience, and patience, leads to us having a more godly character. It's some materials, when you work them, it's like they can only be changed for the better or strengthened through application of heat and hard working with a hammer. There's no other way. Yes?
As we go through this whole lesson, we need to realize all of these things that are happening throughout this lesson are an illustration of what's going to happen to us in the last days.
Yeah. Yes, that is a very good point. Everything that is written in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all of these things are lessons for us that are still applicable today, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament. And, we as Adventists believe that the New Testament is just an encapsulation of the Old Testament. So when you take them both as relevant as each other, then it really reinforces the message of things that have happened in the past are recorded for our benefit in the present so that we can go where God wants us to be in the future. So yes, good point. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, let's go into Sunday's lesson. Who is the Lord? So basically, Pharaoh is saying, if I don't know it, I don't care if I don't know it, and if I don't know it, that means it's not true, because it only matters what I think. I am the ruler of this nation, so if I don't know it, it doesn't matter. The question is, what was Pharaoh's response to God's demand, let my people go, and what significance can be found in this response? So, as we already paraphrased, Pharaoh says, who is God that I should let them go? And he doesn't recognize God's authority. Why did God if he knew that Pharaoh wasn't going to listen, why did he keep having Moses and Aaron ask him and do these different plagues? Why didn't he just say, I'll just kill Pharaoh, push him off to the side, and then Moses and Aaron can just take the Israelites and get out of Egypt?
I think it's more of like God wants Moses to trust him fully.
Yeah.
And it was more like a lesson to him, because down the road when he's gonna go through the desert with all the problems that's gonna happen to him, he wanted him to make sure that he trusts him fully.
Yes.
As all the plagues came upon Egypt, each one of the plagues were redemptive in purpose. It was a revelation that their God was no good. Every single one of them was redemptive.
Yes. Yes. That's kind of like also, that's the other point too. Like what you said is true. God wanted Moses to trust him in spite of what he was encountering. But then plus, the plagues themselves were redemptive. It talks later on in the New Testament that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In fact, God even told Moses he was going to harden his heart. So what does that mean? Did God say, I want you to tell Pharaoh, and Pharaoh wants to do what I say, but I'm going to make sure that he doesn't? What does that mean? That God was hardening Pharaoh's heart?
I view it more like the concept of God. It wasn't God saying, I'm going to make you a loser and lose your salvation and everything. I think it's more Pharaoh looked on God and hardened his heart as a response to God. It wasn't God doing it, it was Pharaoh's response to God.
I like to think that God was also working with Pharaoh as well, because there are examples of other kings that did soften their heart, like Nebuchadnezzar, is an example.
The Pharisees did the same thing. He kept trying to reach out to them to get them to accept him, but they hardened their hearts in response to him. So I view it that way. It's just odd phrasing for us in the way it was translated.
Yeah. I mean, Pontius Pilate, you think God wasn't working with Pontius Pilate, especially when his wife had a dream and she sent a message to him saying he had nothing to do with this man? And Pontius Pilate worked to try and free Jesus. So I think a lot of people in authority are also souls that God is pursuing as well. And we have stories of successes, because Nebuchadnezzar wrote the 4th chapter of Daniel. He says, now I extolled and I praise the God of heaven. So I have to believe that God desired the same thing with Pharaoh. What if Pharaoh had says, you're right, and I'm going to, let them go? And then Pharaoh would have also been saved as well. Any other questions or comments?
I think what happens here is when you say that, so God hardened Pharaoh's heart. How you respond to God determines whether you harden your heart or whether you become acceptable. That's what you just said. Okay. Yeah, because God comes and says, I'm going to give you a new heart, not a heart of stone, and so forth. And so if you don't accept it, and you say Pharaoh heart, by that metaphor or whatever he's talking about, Pharaoh hardened his heart. He chose a heart of stone.
Yeah, do you remember that example that's always talked about? Like you have the sun and it shines on two different materials. Remember what those materials were? And they have two different responses. So one shines on wax and it melts, and the other one is exposed to clay and the clay hardens. So it's kind of like we have that choice. Is our heart harden like the clay, or does it soften like the wax? That's our decision. Question down below says, if someone asks, do you know the Lord, how would you respond? And if yes, what would you say he is like and why? So before I just throw that question out, I just want to say that I thought about this, and you can see that everybody has their own perspective, right? Like if we were all asked individually, we all have our own individual journeys, and there's things that we latch onto stronger than other things. And you can see this in the Gospels, that were written. Each writer of the Gospel emphasizes something different. It's not that they're making it up, but it's just that they're emphasizing something that resonates with them. So as an example, Matthew, the way he talks about the lineage of Christ, his emphasis is on Christ being the promised one. And then Mark, he seems to emphasize the suffering of Christ. So he emphasizes Christ as the suffering servant. And then Luke, let's see. I wrote it down over here. Luke. Yeah. Oh, I only wrote. Oh, okay, yeah. So Luke's emphasis is on God being the Son of Man. In fact, I think he's the only one that talks about a little bit on the childhood of Christ. So is that Christ came, but he was also not just the Son of God, but the Son of Man. And then John, what is John's emphasis? Yes. And when I read the beginning of John, it sounds an awful lot like the beginning of Genesis too. And Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God and with God, and he created all things so that without him nothing was created. John really emphasizes the creative powers and the divinity of Christ before he incarnated into the human race. Yes, ma'am.
If someone were to come to you and say, do you know the Lord? Or you were to say that to somebody else, how would you know whether their proofs hold water or not? What they're saying holds water.
You mean like if I asked somebody and they said...
Yeah, if you asked me and I gave you a reason, how do you know what I say is a valid reason?
Well, there's...
Because people say things about our president. You have one side,
Yeah.
and they all say this. Depending on what side you're on, you have this view, okay? But I don't know our president.
Yeah. Yeah, so, well, you can say a lot of people dispute the validity of the Bible, right? The Bible is just a bunch of stories. It's just made up. But if you are objective, you can see that the Bible is logical, right? There is certain logic. Some of us may throw out logic, and we may say, things that are just preposterous, but God does have universal standards and laws, and that if we think objectively about those, then we can say, yeah, the Bible is logical. It is consistent. Sometimes it requires looking just, a little below the surface, right? But if you do that and you use the Bible's own words, what they call it, the hermeneutics, that Isaiah says, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little, and he repeats it twice. In other words, you use the Bible to interpret itself. So you see that the Bible is very consistent. The Bible is historical. There is not one piece of archaeological evidence that contradicts the Bible. They may say, we haven't found any archaeological findings that David existed. Therefore, the Bible's not true. Well, just because you can't find it doesn't mean it's not true. And then later on, they did find. And the same thing with a lot of the musical instruments that are described. You say, there's no evidence, that they used these instruments. And then they say that of all the archaeological evidence, we've only uncovered 2% of everything that can be recovered. The other thing is the Bible is moral. It has a moral law. And some people will say, well, how can God be moral when he gave his only son to die for us? That's not very nice. Why didn't he die for himself? These are arguments that are out there. People will say, well, look at all the people that were killed and slaughtered. But once again, when you go beneath the surface, you find that God was very long suffering. And then the other thing is the Bible is very personal. So, yes, there is history. Yes, there are laws. Yes, there is doctrine. But it's also very personal. When you read in the Psalms, when you read in the Proverbs, God strives to bring us back into the fold. And that's all accumulated in his first coming, where, number one, we have sinned and we deserve the penalty of death, so he took on that penalty. But also, he showed us what God is really like. It's not like you ever studied mythology? The gods are very distant, they don't care, they're evil. God is a very personal God, that he's merciful and he's just. And that formula, that makes up the love that God has for us. So if you were to tell me that you know the Lord, there are certain things that you would say that, kind of would probably resonate with me, because God puts into everybody a desire to know God. It's just in us. And the people that say, I don't want to know God, they try, and nature abhors a vacuum, right? You know what happens when you have a vacuum? It tries to fill itself. So it's going to fill itself with something. So if you say, I don't want to know God, I don't want anything to do with God, you're going to fill yourself with something. And what you fill yourself up usually brings on a lot of pain, a lot of heartache. So we all have that inner desire, to know God. Some of us know more, some of us know less. So what you're saying is, first of all, it's going to be on your personal experience. So I can't dispute your personal experience.
I think there's truth to that.
Yeah.
But I look, all of us have our favorite preacher. We grow, and I remember or I recall listening to one of his sermons, and he said when he was a young pastor, he had a church, and he said there was a distinguished young lady in my church, and he did his best to give sermons, and that, you know, when they come to shake the pastor's hands, she would come to him and say, it'll be a great day when you get to know the Lord. And he was flabbergasted. He got to the point where he didn't really like this woman anymore. Mm-hmm. But the reason he didn't like it is because she was pointing out that maybe he didn't know the Lord the way he should. And he kind of looked at his own life. He'd been raised a Seventh-day Adventist. Father was a preacher. He became a preacher. He kind of followed that line. But he had no real personal experience with God. You know, and nothing that showed he had this interaction. You know, he read the Bible, he prayed, and he did this, but he had none of that experience. And I can also recall at Andrews, they had a theology teacher there who taught religion, and he really challenged the students' beliefs. You know, why do you believe this? This theologian says this. This one says this. You know, what do you really believe? And a lot of parents got upset with this guy because they're saying, you're not towing the line here. And his response is, you have all these people that have been born and raised a Seventh-day Adventist, but they really don't know why they believe the way they believe. They only believe this way because they've been told to believe this way. That's the way they've been raised. They've been raised in this cocoon.
Yeah.
So if you can't, the way I look at it, if you can't give a testimony of why brought you to Christ and that personal experience, then I think there's a valid reason when somebody will say, you really don't know God. You may have read about him, you may have prayed to him, but unless you have that experience where God, you know that God was with you hand in hand and led you, I question it, because I can have an intellectual thought about God, but that doesn't make me saved.
Yeah, what you're saying kind of reminds me of Paul, because Paul was very knowledgeable about the scriptures. He was very passionate about what he believed, right? And that's probably why God was able to use him as well. I don't know. You could say that Paul knew God, but he knew him maybe not in the right way. And that's why God was able to, when God says, it's hard to kick against the pricks, to me that seems to allude that Paul was already struggling. He was, like he knew something wasn't right. So when Christ appeared to him, it was, that was it. He was already. I feel like he was already having a conversion experience, and then that just, because otherwise, it's like what Jesus says. Some people have miracles done, and they're like, we still don't believe it. Like when Lazarus was raised from the dead, many people believed, but the Pharisees just said, you know what? We gotta kill Jesus, and we're gonna try and kill Lazarus. So, yeah. So.
But that's it. When Paul was before the crowd in Jerusalem, when the temple, when they wanted, the Romans had to come and rescue him, and he said, "Let me speak to him." He told about his testimony, how he was on the road to Damascus, and God appeared to him. He didn't go back and go to the law or this or that. He spoke, this is how I know. I had this experience with God. And you can't, we try to create that for our young people. We have them go out and sell books and this and that and other things. But it's got to be that genuine experience. And I don't know how you get your children to have that. Because I look at my children and I say, that's what they really need. They need that genuine experience with the Lord. And then you may talk to them and you see, hey, they had a little bit of one. There might have been a reason for this. But that's really what it's important is, what is that experience you had that brought you to God?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be different for everybody. Just two things. I remember Steve Vail, when he did the evangelistic series here back in 2008, 2009, and one of the things he always emphasized, he would ask, he says, have you studied what you believe? Because there's many people that come from different denominations and different faiths, and they're there because that's the way they were raised, that's what they were told. But have they studied out what they believe? And then the second point, when you're saying like everybody's experience is different, you know, I can just say like for myself, in case any of you are wondering, I mean, you know, I've said it before, but you know, I'm convert, but one of the things that I really gravitated toward was Christ being the divine creator. So that's why when I look at all the gospel introductions, I really gravitate toward John's introduction. And because it mimics Genesis, that the God that created us also came and redeemed us, so he bought us twice. So that's my kind of little glimpse of my personal experience, and I'm sure you all have your own. And I think whether we're converts or whether we're raised, you know, we're going to have those experiences because God is ministering to everybody. So, any other questions or comments about that? Okay, let's go into Monday's lesson. A rough start, it's called. It says, though Moses must have known even from the beginning that what the Lord had tasked him with was not going to be easy, hence his attempts to get out of it, he probably had no idea of what was coming. In other words, like worse than he thought. So going to Exodus 5, 3 through 23, what were the immediate results of Moses and Aaron's first recorded encounter with Pharaoh? So what was the result? We talked about this in the introduction, was that Pharaoh says, not only am I not going to let the Israelites go, not only do I not want to know who God is and whose authority you're coming under, but I'm going to really show you who's boss. I'm going to multiply their sorrows of what they're doing now. I'm going to make it worse for them. And you can't stop me because I'm Pharaoh. So, and then when Moses and Aaron talked to the leaders of Israel, what did they do? They're like first in chapter 4, I think 29, when Moses and Aaron first told the Israelites, they were quite happy. You know, they're like, oh, you know, what we've been waiting for, we're going to be delivered. You know, and then instead of being delivered, their sorrows multiplied, and now they're mad. It's like, you made it worse for us. Not only are we not delivered, you made it worse for us. Now we're really suffering. We thought we were suffering before and we were under bondage. Now we're really suffering, and we're still here. So they're mad at Moses, and then it goes on in 5:21. It says, it asks to put ourselves in these people's, in the Israelites' places. Now, it's not unreasonable what they're complaining about. I think that's right. If you have this hope, and then instead what happens is you're driven into the ground more, it's very disappointing. And we're talking physical suffering and hardships along with that. It's like if you're like a child and one of your parents says they'll talk to the other parent and see what they can do about your punishment, and then you end up getting punished worse. Like, that's not what, you know, you had in mind. So, So it's understandable, you know, the way they felt and the way things were going. And so now Moses and Aaron, they're not only encountering the resistance with Pharaoh, but they're also encountering a hostility with the very people that they're trying to deliver. So you're getting it from both sides.
Pharaoh's pretty smart. He's not attacking Moses or Aaron. He's not making martyrs out of them. He didn't kill them.
Yeah.
He just went out and said, all right, I'm going to hit the people that you supposedly are representing. And I think he was smart. He realized they don't really know you any more than they know me. But they do know how to make bricks. This is what they do, so I'm going to make it hard for them. And it's a clever, I mean, the world does this today. If we don't like what a country's doing, what does our government do? It puts an embargo on them or puts a tariff or says, well, you're not going to get access to capital until you respond the way we want you to respond.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're talking about like leverage. Like whenever you want to make a deal, you have to have leverage. Like if you go into your boss and you ask for a raise, you have to have the leverage that, hey, I'm doing this good of a work, and if you don't have me, I'm not going to be so easy to replace, and you're going to lose this much productivity. You know, you got to have like leverage. But one thing that you mentioned with Aaron and Moses is that Pharaoh didn't kill them. Like if you want to really just you know cut it off at the root, just kill them, and then you don't have to deal with it. But it's interesting, he didn't kill them. Instead, it's like he's like, hey, this is a challenge. I'm going to show you that your God is not all powerful. So, I think that was the result of pride. Yes.
I've been listening to sermons by Pastor Pavel Goya, and he tells the experience that he had in communist countries about education. Education was 6 days a week. And of course, he wouldn't go on Sabbath. And his professor says, you've got to come on Sabbath. And he says, I won't. And she says, the government will force you to do it. And he says, no, they won't force me to do it. And he went to school on Thursday, and that's what she was saying. Tomorrow, I mean, if Saturday you don't come, you'll be out of school. And he went on Friday, and the teacher was dumbfounded because that day, the president of the country had said, we're not going to have school on Saturday anymore. We can't afford it. And he said, the government will force you to do it. Government is stronger than your God. No,
Yeah.
God is the strongest.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
As I'm reading the story of Moses and it just really deepening in with it, I always have this question of like Moses was living with the royal family until he was 40 years old. He was out for 40 years and came back. So I'm wondering if he even knew the Pharaoh from his childhood that was in command at that time. And even if he was younger than the 40 years that he was out, could it be that this Pharaoh heard of Moses and heard of like all the things that he was doing or whatever, and did they have more of a relationship other than being a Pharaoh and a Moses?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the way the movie, paints it, the one with Charlton Heston. But there's also other things like in the movie that are not, in the Bible too, like for instance, where Pharaoh watches his whole army, wiped out. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible just says that Pharaoh and his army were wiped out. It's possible, and I've never delved into that. But yeah, I mean, he was taken into the royal family. He was educated in everything, as far as all the latest and greatest knowledge, and and yet God still had to educate him in other ways, for those 40 years after. So, but yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's likely, that there's.
They studied genealogy pretty extensively, and they probably, even though he maybe never met him, he might have been a young pharaoh. It was told about this guy, So he probably recognized them. Hey, this is my great uncle Moses. Twice removed, something.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, let's go into Tuesday's lesson, the divine eye. So we're talking about how Moses is getting it from both sides, and he's very discontent. And what does Moses do after he gets it from Pharaoh, he gets it from the Israelite leaders? What does Moses do?
It's an escalation. They've hit the Israelites. Where, you're not going to get straw, but we're not. But we still need the same number of bricks. So what's the economic lifeline of Egypt? The Nile River. So I think God is doing this for a reason. He wants to bring as many people to God as he can. And if you really read what happens, the people that went out weren't just the Israelites. There were a lot of Egyptians that went with them, because they maybe saw that this pantheon, this belief system is garbage. But God is going right after. They worshiped the Nile. The Nile was their economic lifeline. So what does he do? He goes right after it.
Yeah, that's definitely what happened with the plagues. Then how about immediately after Moses is just feeling this from both sides? What does he do? He goes to God. And what does he do? He complains.
Yeah.
It's like, what have you picked me for to lead these people out? This isn't going on. You've picked me on a failed mission. But then what does God say? First of all, he talks.
Verse 1 of chapter 7. He says, so the Lord said to Moses, see, I made you as God to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is seen as God, but he says, no, I made you as God. And Aaron, your brother, shall be your prophet.
Yeah, and that's probably why Pharaoh is not killing Moses either, because he's contending with him. He's contending with him as another power structure.
And that's a reason, too, why they hit the Nile and everything, because you got to remember all these things. They were so polytheistic. They had so many different gods. The Nile was one of them. Everything that they...
The frogs,
everything. Everything that the plagues hit was proving that those gods were false and he was the true God, that God is the real God.
So God affirms who he is, what he has promised. He made a covenant with Abraham, and he established his covenant, and he also promised them the promised land. So he's saying, this is who I am, and this is what I promised. I haven't changed. I'm still God, and I haven't reneged on my promise. I'm going to fulfill my promise. And then he goes on and says that he's going to do these 4 things. He's going to bring them from the yoke of the Egyptians. He's going to free them from being slaves. He's going to redeem them with mighty acts. And then it says that no prophet has had the mighty acts that was shown as Moses did. And then it says that he will be the Israelites' God, and the Israelites will be his people. So he's going to do those four things. He just reiterates that, and then gives them that charge to go back and talk to Pharaoh. So the question is it okay to complain to God, and are there other characters that have complained to God? So, well, we could look at Psalms 142 too. Let's go ahead and turn to that. We're just Psalms 142, verse 2. And it says, this is David writing this, I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. So definitely, David complained before God. But he did it in a way that he had faith of what God would ultimately do. Who are some other characters that have complained? Elijah, yeah. Yeah. Only I am left. There's nobody. This is messed up. Go back there. There's 7,000 other people that haven't bowed.
I think it's all right to complain to God or to put our petitions before God. But if we try to use it as a way to rationalize, like you said, there's nobody else but me, you can't let me die because there's nobody else but me, or you got to help me. And then God says, well, there are 7,000 that haven't done that, so, or whatever the number was, I can't remember specifically.
Yeah, I think it was 7,000.
7,000, and things like that. Or like Jonah's complaint, it was like, I wanted this city wiped out. His was really a bad complaint.
Yeah.
I wanted this city wiped out, and I knew you were going to be merciful.
What about Job?
Yeah.
Job, in Job chapter 3, the first 26 verses, he's talking about how it would have been better if he were never born. But he suffered a lot. And then what did Job's wife say? Curse God and die. Just be done with this. But he didn't. But God didn't rebuke Job's wife because it is understandable what she was suffering. And Abraham, when he was contending with God with Sodom and Gomorrah, he didn't say, it was like, well, you're not going to do that. What if there's 50 righteous people? What if there's 40? This isn't like you to do that. And all the way down to 10, but there wasn't even 10.
But if you're going to complain to God, that's the way to do it. Because Abraham was complaining, he said, hey, you're not going to be seen as righteous if you go and do this. Mm-hmm. He's complaining to God in such a way as, I know you're merciful. I know you're loving. I know that you're these things. So if I say, and I'm not trying to say you can manipulate God, because you can't. But if you say, pejorative, your kingdom, I want to do something for your kingdom, or this thing, I think there's a way to complain to God or petition God. And there's a way not to do it, like Jonah. I knew you were going to be merciful. Well, yeah.
Well, yeah. I think Job complained on a very personal basis as well, too. But, like I say, he did not know that God was using him to illustrate a point to the whole universe. So, and in the end, God blessed him. Yes?
I think it's significant that in this context of this questioning God and wanting to know why, God introduces himself as the I am. And rather than calling him the I am, which is I am in the past, I am in the present, I am in the future, it's God is introducing himself as the intimate God. You may have questions, you may have problems, but come to me and let's talk together. Let's reason together. let's be intimate, and then you will see. When we are intimate together, then you will see that I work things out the best.
Yeah. And that same illustration is in Isaiah when Isaiah writes, says, come, let us reason together. God doesn't say, hey, just do it my way, and I don't want any questions. God is a God of reason. So he wants us to follow him because it's in our best interest, and he wants us to be with him eternally. Okay, we're almost out of time. We've got a couple minutes left. So in Wednesday's lesson, Moses always keeps talking about uncircumcised lips. I think that's his way of saying that he doesn't speak very well. And God, gives him Aaron, to go with him. Instead of just saying, look, I qualify the ones that I call. I don't call the qualified, Instead, he relents. God always meets us where we're at. If you look at a lot of Jesus' healings, some had more faith and some had less faith, but God always met people where they were. So the people, like I think the blind beggar, where he took like the mud and put it on his eyes, God didn't have to do that, and Jesus didn't have to do that to heal him, but he did that because I think the beggar needed that touch, to know that God was working with him. But then you had the centurion that says, hey, you don't even have to come. Just say the word. And I think it's the same case here. God is meeting Moses where he is so that he has that level of comfort. Down below it asks the question, it says, think through the phrase, I will take you as my people and I will be your God. Though the context was corporate, how does this apply to each one of us individually, and how should this relationship be manifested in our daily lives? In other words, God does minister to us individually. We saw this with Abraham, right? Abraham, before he started this great nation, he ministered to Abraham individually. Joseph, he was alone. He was a slave, sold as a slave in Egypt, and God worked with him individually. Daniel is another example. Daniel proposed in his heart he wasn't going to defile himself, and God gave him visions, and he became, a great ruler in not only Babylon but Persia afterwards. We saw how God appeared to Job out of the whirlwind. Noah, he says, I want you to build this ark, and I'm going to give them 120 years. So, yes.
I was just thinking, even though it was a corporate call to the people, he also wanted to speak to them individually, because later he developed he had Moses set up the tabernacle where each person could come individually and worship God. He wanted to be there with his people, present with them in that tabernacle, reaching out to each one of them individually, even though it was a corporate call. Who makes up the corporation? The people, and
Yeah.
he wanted to reach out to each one of them and develop that personal relationship again, because they had lost it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, is that, right, the people make up the church, so God ministers to us on an individual basis as well as a group. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think it goes back, when you say, how do you know God, or things like that, when you say you were part of the covenant, we're Christians. I remember long time ago when I was young, I was much slimmer. Didn't have any gray hair. I had brown hair and so forth. The company sent me to Austria. And when I was in Austria, one of the Austrian engineers told me, they can tell you're an American. And I said, well, why? My voice? He says, no, they can tell you, they don't have to talk to you and they'll know you're American. And I said, well, why? He said, well, one, Americans all wear tennis shoes. We wear nice leather shoes. Two, Americans in the summertime will wear shorts. Do you see anybody wearing a lot of shorts? And I'm looking and I said, no, they're all wearing jeans. They're not wearing shorts. And he says, and then you wear ball caps or things like that. They can tell you're an American. When you belong to God, when you are part of the covenant, how do they know you're a Christian? How do they know that? And it should be how you conduct yourself. I have brothers that are not Christians. They're secular people. They're good people, don't get me wrong. But they always kind of move in what is their self-interest. Okay? That's not necessarily a wrong thing to do. But they'll look at Jill and I and they say, why are you giving money to that church? And we'll respond, because we want to see the work of the God go forward, and this is one of the ways that we can help do that. And they look at that, well, why? God, if God is God, doesn't he have all the money in the world? And I say, no, I need to do this. I need to give this as part of my heart and what I need to do in my connection with God. I am motivated to do it. Not because I think God can't do it without me, but he wants me to join in with him.
Yeah, it's always been his intent, from the beginning, that the people participate in this plan of salvation. And everybody wants to be part of something really big, really great, or be next to somebody, somebody famous, or be in a power structure, or, whatever. And so God is also doing this for us, because in the end, when this earth is gone, we can look back and say that God used us to fulfill his plan, and that would be an honor for all eternity. So, okay, we are over. So does anybody want to say closing prayer at all? Okay.
Dear Heavenly and gracious Father, we're so thankful that we can come here and have Sabbath school, discuss the Bible, and as we're discussing Exodus, one of the times that you were triumphant in this world, may we put our faith in you, that when we are faced with obstacles, that you can see us through. We ask that you bless our church, our school, and everyone here, our families and our loved ones, and that those that are in need, whether it be financial or sick, that you will bless them. And may the pastor's words reach our hearts and motivate us to live in a closer relationship with you. In thy name forever. Amen.
All right, thank you, Matt. Okay, all right, thank you.